Ja, das ist eine sehr merkwürdige Sache. Ich glaube, das erste Mal, dass ich mit dem Film irgendetwas zu tun hatte, war im Jahr 1904. Ich war damals 14 Jahre alt. In einem Kino sah ich da zum ersten Mal einen Film, der hieß The Great Train Robbery.
We don't know much about Fritz Lang. We know he was prone to exaggerating the stories of his life, either out of amusement or privacy. We know he allegedly met with Goebbels, who offered him the leading rank of the German film industry, and that he fled the country that same day. We know his father was an architect in Vienna, and that before becoming a filmmaker, he wanted to be a painter. In fact, the choice to make movies for the rest of his life was a pretty arbitrary one. Lang started out writing scripts for silent films. As a painter, he was fascinated by the moving image and began to dream up scenarios for the screen. He tells the story of how one day he took himself and a few friends to see a film he'd written, only to his surprise his name wasn't credited. The role of author had been attributed to the director. Lang didn't like how the scenes had been interpreted, and so he decided never to give up that control again. Over the next 10 years, during the 1920s, Fritz Lang would make some of the biggest movies to come out of Germany, most notably Metropolis, a huge-scale sci-fi epic that divided audiences at the time, although it's now considered one of the greatest films ever made. Even in his earlier work from this decade, we can see a man very much in control of his medium, and there's no denying that that control continued into what is arguably his best work, M. Much has been said on the revolutionary use of sound in this film. Coming out in 1931, only a few years after talkies were invented, this was Lang's first non-silent picture, and it's impressive just how mature and inventive he is with such a young technology. The same way title cards were crucial to the progression of story in the silent era, sound is an integral part of this film. It's more than a technical novelty. It plays a real, dramatic role. The element that best represents this and that's most talked about is the whistle. The film follows the hunt for a child murderer, and for the first 20 minutes of the movie, the only signifier we have to identify him is that whistle. Every time we hear it, we know what to expect, to the degree that it becomes a placeholder for the killings. It's worth mentioning that the whistle we hear in the film is actually Lang himself. His lack of musical talent adds to the uneven, stilted rhythm of a serial killer. Lang understood the power of withholding information. There's not a single murder that occurs on screen. Rather, we see the smoke after the fire. Sure, maybe it's more tasteful to cut to a child's ball rolling in the grass and an unaccompanied balloon drift up to the sky, but it's also more emotionally impactful. Just as important as sound is silence. Sometimes there's no sound at all. Now, it's easy to disregard this as primitive and an oversight in the production, but that's not the case. Take this scene. You'd expect to hear the cars and the footsteps on the sidewalk. Turns out others thought the same thing, and it was actually dubbed in for releases in other countries. But adding sound changes the mood of the scene. It becomes a regular establishing shot instead of the tense moment it's supposed to be. This happens a couple times in the film too, so it goes to show just how carefully each technical element was thought out. Lang's attention to detail carries into the framing of the camera. In this shot, we float through a beggar's union, taking in all the little quirks of this underground world. The collection of used cigarettes, the moldy cheese and sausage.
Hosse in Blutwurst. Pfui Deibel stinkt der Käse gut.
Lang researched his films heavily before production, so everything that ends up in the film is based on some real experience.
Schwarz seid ihr Luders!
The camera revels in these details. And yet there's also an authorial distance to it. This is not a subjective view.
Mensch, schnarch nicht so, du wächst leise.
We stand outside of the action, looking in, like a newsreel with visual flair. Perhaps the best amalgamation of all these things, sound, story, camera, is this infamous shot.
Du hast aber einen schönen Ball. Wie heißt du denn?
Every dramatic element is distilled into one frame, while also being visually interesting and exciting, a staple of any great filmmaker. It's honestly kind of amazing how modern M feels today. Even when he's not on screen, the killer's presence pushes the movie forward. It moves at the same rapid pace of most thrillers that have come out in recent years. After the first murder, which occurs in the opening 10 minutes, we are swept along by cops, city officials, gang leaders, and street urchins as each facet of the city searches for the culprit. It's interesting to note that the only real time we spend with the victims and their parents are at the beginning and the end. The rest of the film is a manhunt, in every sense of the word. The way Lang manages to keep up that quick rhythm is by cutting to the following scene before the first has a chance to finish. Dialogue will often bridge two very different moments in time or locations, another example of the deliberate use of sound. Now, not only does this affect pacing, but the juxtaposition of scenes allows us to draw parallels between the very different social classes.
Wir üben unseren Beruf aus, weil wir existieren müssen. Aber diese Bestie hat kein Recht zu existieren. Die muss weg. Die muss ausgerottet werden, vertilgt. Ohne Gnade und Barmherzigkeit.
The gangs want the killer off the streets because of a rise in police raids in their basements, bars, and other places of business. The police want him caught for the obvious reasons. Although their motives may be drastically different, we see just how similarly the gears behind these two organizations turn.
Ich bitte, sich dazu zu äußern, meine Herren.
Lang shoots the secret meeting of the mobsters in a very similar style to the police headquarters. Characters are obscured by heavy shadow and smoke. There's a sense of both structured hierarchy and blind confusion. We see two rooms of rough-looking men bicker and complain about a task as menial and as necessary as their jobs.
Wir müssen ihn fahren. Wir selber.
On a structural level, the film is very much aware of the audience's desire to see the killer. Maybe not the killings, although that's always been a debate in cinema, but the man himself, to spend time with him, see what he's up to as the whole town is out looking for him. From the start to about the halfway point, it balloons into a large-scale chase. We get only one good look at our killer, and it's almost shocking how unassuming and anticlimactic it is. After that, the film zooms in from a wide tapestry of cops and criminals to an abrupt close-up of its true subject, the one we've been waiting to catch a glimpse of. In the eyes of many, my own included, this is where the film is really elevated to greatness, with Peter Lorre's performance. Up until this point, the only real characterization we've been shown is his habitual whistling, this nervous tick that signals the capture and death of another child.
Dankeschön.
To be honest, I don't know if audiences in 1931 were ready for the face that went along with that ominous tune. This was Lorre's first major role, and it's his pudgy, childlike features that capture and emit so much complexity in what could have been a one-note performance. This is a great benefit we get from the transition from silent films to talkies, is the nuance and variation of tone and natural speech. It's a testament to Lorre that even with the film muted, we can read so much of his character's turmoil in those big, bulging eyes. People who've seen the movie know about the famous trial scene at the end, but on second watch, it struck me just how expressive his whole body is, especially in scenes with no dialogue at all. There are moments where I can't help but root for his escape. Lang was very much aware of the public's fascination with stories of crime and true terror, especially in Germany following the wake of the war. Headlines would spell out the latest tragedy in bold letters, and people all over the world would gobble it up. We are irresistibly drawn to and repelled by terrible things, and the film exploits these emotions to great effect. That's what fiction does. It allows us to explore our deepest fantasies in the comfort of our own privacy without having to atone for them. Instead, we sit back and watch the characters play them out, invested in their trials and tribulations, yet always from a safe distance. Aside from its riveting dramatic power, the final trial scene played a great social role for contemporary audiences. Debate around the death penalty was very much alive among German moviegoers. To see a jury made up of criminals cast judgment upon another criminal, one who claims he has no control over his actions, was like holding up a mirror to those in the theater.
Violence has become, in my opinion, a definite point in a script. It has a dramaturgical reason to be there. You see, I don't think that people believe in the devil with the horns and the forked tail, and therefore they don't believe in punishment after they are dead. So my question was, for me, what are people, in what believe people, or what are people fearing is better? And that is physical pain. And physical pain comes from violence. And that, I think, is today the only fact which people really fear, and therefore it has become a definite part of life, and naturally also of scripts.
It probably won't surprise you to find out that the film held some real-world repercussions. Originally titled Murderers Amongst Us, it's a wonder that the film ever got made in the first place. The Nazis were rising to power, and they took issue with the title as they thought it shed a negative light on their authority. They would later use Laurie's performance as an example of subhuman debauchery and their propaganda. Laurie was of Jewish descent. Him and Lang both fled to America before Hitler took full control of the country, where they were welcomed with open arms and were able to continue making films. Laurie became one of the great character actors of Hollywood, usually taking on supporting roles as the villain or psychopath. He never quite left the shadow cast by the role that launched him to stardom. As for Lang, his mastery over the medium continued to evolve, particularly in film noir. He made over 20 more movies over the course of 20 years, yet even if M was his last, he still would have left an indelible mark over all of cinema to come.